All right. So why don't I go ahead and get started? And I'm going to focus on something today that I've been thinking about for a while that I imagine many of us have been puzzled by. And it's a question about why disinformation circulates. Why is it that at this moment in American political history, we have so much conspiracy theories, so many people believing so many strange things? What is giving rise to this here and now? And if there's an explanation, maybe that can help us to start figuring out what we need to do about it. So that's the big canvas backdrop to all of this. And then there's a much more precise problem, right? From Stop the Steal to QAnon, to the fact that it's looking increasingly likely that Donald Trump or people closely associated with him will be prosecuted criminally, civilly, for events in the last couple months of his presidency, maybe even some stuff to do with the way in which he runs his business. And then this raises, I think, a really tricky issue for the period surrounding the trial. If he's convicted, then perpetually, and as long as he's in jail. And that is, what do we do? Let's say, and I think I'm being conservative here, that a third of the American population believes that this was a political hit job, that the Justice Department or whichever prosecutor brings the case against him, that the deep state ultimately are responsible for Donald Trump having been framed and convicted on rigged charges. And not just obviously that puts a great deal of energy and anger and destructive emotion into American politics, but it also undermines faith and trust in the administration of the law and justice, in the criminal justice system in particular. The Department of Justice, the FBI, are already in the crosshairs. And so this is a real problem for American democracy, for the institution of the rule of law, for the trust in the criminal justice system, if we are on the cusp of prosecuting Donald Trump, and if a substantial portion of our population does not view this as justified, but simply as a political hit job. So the reasons to think that Trump is in the crosshairs are manifold, right? We've got the congressional investigation, which of course cannot bring criminal charges. It's not a prosecutorial body, it's merely an investigative body, but it does seem to be setting the agenda for the Department of Justice. You may have seen the Department of Justice recently just subpoenaed every bit of evidence that the National Archive has shared with the January 6th committee. And so there's an effort, it appears, within the Department of Justice to either replicate or fact check or see how much of the findings of the January 6th committee it can reproduce. And the January 6th committee is also setting the tone, I think, for the appetite for prosecuting Trump on the part of, let's call it 60% of Americans who now seem to believe that the president is responsible for the events of January 6th, for a underlying conspiracy to try to interfere with or overturn the results of the election, and that he should be prosecuted for that conduct. And so that's the first level. Second level then is the Department of Justice, which is looking into all of these events. We don't know very much about how it's proceeding, right? The January 6th committee is a made-for-TV affair, and so we see everything that it does. The Department of Justice tries to hide as much as possible some of its activity in the next investigation, which is into the retaining of highly classified information by the former president, may in fact be redacted and then revealed. That seems to be where we're headed in terms of the affidavit of support for the warrant to I'm sorry, search Mar-a-Lago. And when we get to this third item, this is where I think the clearest threat of immediate prosecution is to be found. And that is because, right, the FBI and the Department of Justice, acting in concert last week, searched Mar-a-Lago, found documents there that are not legally allowed to be outside of a secure government facility, are not allowed to be in the possession of a private citizen, which is what Donald Trump now is. And so the mere possession of those documents, irrespective of intent, as I understand the law, is a clear violation of the Espionage Act. And so this is now just in the question of prosecutorial discretion. Should, if Donald Trump has clearly violated the law here, he be in fact charged, prosecuted, perhaps convicted. And it is the case that in the past, when other administrative officials have violated the Espionage Act by bringing documents home with them, they have often pled to misdemeanor offenses. This is a felony offense. But those officials have cooperated with the Department of Justice, admitted to their misconduct, indicated remorse, right? And so the circumstances that guide the discretion the prosecutor has all line up around being lenient with those individuals. The opposite is the case with Donald Trump. And so the idea that perhaps, although there's some discretion here, it shouldn't be used to allow Donald Trump to suffer a slap on the wrist or walk away from this, but that the full force of the law should be brought to bear on him. Those considerations seem to point pretty clearly in that direction. There are also other criminal statutes that were cited in the warrant: obstruction of an investigation, theft of government documents. In addition, Trump is under investigation in Georgia for the mischief he did with regards to the election there. I assume this is reasonably well known, the notorious phone call, which was recorded and then transcribed, in which he asked the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to find 11,000 votes to change the outcome of the Georgia election. Other things to do with trying to create an alternative slate of electors, providing false testimony to members of the Atlanta state legislature. And again, multiple criminal counts potentially being brought against people like Rudy Giuliani or even Donald Trump. And then fifth and finally, the investigation into Trump business practices, which currently appears more likely to pose for Donald Trump himself an issue of civil as opposed to criminal liability. But that could change, right? Note that when Donald Trump went in front of the grand jury, he pled the Fifth Amendment apparently around 400 times, and that might lead the New York City District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, to revisit his decision to suspend the criminal investigation into the Trump enterprises, which he was conducting. But he has got a conviction of the chief financial officer of the Trump organization. And as part of the plea bargain there, the officer has agreed to cooperate with the further investigation. So just a lot of different places where Trump could end up in court soon, and hence the deep danger of highly polarized public reaction to this, with a substantial portion of the American population seeing this as a witch hunt, a kangaroo court, political payback, and not a genuine administration of criminal justice. And while I'm going to assume that, like me, you don't view that as well-founded, it is nevertheless something that I think we have to take seriously as potentially quite destructive. And please Don't get me wrong, that's not a reason not to prosecute, but it is a reason to figure out how so many people could be hoodwinked into believing that Donald Trump has done nothing wrong, assuming that he is ultimately tried and convicted. We've gone through this together before, that there are different legal considerations as well as broader political considerations. Are the elements of the crime clear? Would a jury be likely to convict? I think at this point, the direction, the preponderance of the evidence seems to point to yes answers to both of those questions. So the real question is, would it be in the public interest to prosecute Trump? And there are clear reasons to answer this question, yes. And some, I think, quite compelling reasons to answer this question, no. And so this presents the dilemma, right? The reasons in the affirmative has to do with, on the one hand, the fact that to fail to prosecute for clear crimes committed by a president while in office suggests to future presidents that they are above the law, that they have no need to worry about legal prosecution, even if they lose the next election and the opposite party comes into power, right? And it also sends a terrible message to everyone else that we have, in a sense, two legal systems, one for the powerful, one for the ordinary. The ordinary people are being prosecuted to the full force of the law and are ending up in jail, but the president and his circle don't get prosecuted because they have the capacity to convince the public that they are innocent, irrespective of what the actual underlying fact scenario is. And then, right, the deeper political question here, not just a legal question, has to do with whether anyone who isn't already convinced, on the one hand, that Donald Trump is guilty, and on the other hand, that it is an abnegation for a president to use the powers entrusted in him by the people of the United States to try to overturn an election, right? So can we fix what ails American democracy by prosecuting Donald Trump? And here I think the answer is a quite clear no. But having said that, that then pulls us into the horns of this dilemma. Won't this be deeply polarizing? Won't many people view this as the administration of Joe Biden going after the leader of the rival party, the likely nominee to face Joe Biden in the next election, right? And that just looks like a banana republic. And so many people are going to be inclined to mistrust not just the prosecution, but the entire administration and perhaps the entire apparatus of the court system, the rule of law, the Department of Justice. It could be genuinely corrosive of the institutions that sustain the rule of law in American democracy. So now let's pull back and start thinking about, how could so many people be so deeply misled about the nature of our current political reality? And I'll just point out to you, right, that if we do an average of recent polls, it looks like 70% of Republicans on average do not believe that Joe Biden was legitimately elected. Please note that for Democrats, that figure is minuscule, maybe 5 or 10% at most. That this therefore is being described as a theft of the election, and this Stop the Steal campaign, so-called, which has been seeded by Donald Trump and his supporters, has really captured the American right, captured the Republican Party. More than half of the people who've won primaries for the GOP believe that, or I should be careful, I don't want to just reproduce the headline. I would say more accurately, they have campaigned on the basis of the idea that the election was stolen. I think I've pointed you to Matthew Continetti's very good history of the last 100 years in the Republican Party and the way in which the party has, in a sense, uncomfortably housed two competing factions, one of which is a big business faction, an almost oligarchic faction, and the other of which is a deeply populist faction. And the way in which over the last 10 to 15 years on Continetti's analysis, the populist faction has escaped the control of the big business faction, right? And so for the previous 80 to 90 years, the big business faction needed the populist faction to get elected, but also was able to bridle, to harness, to control the populist faction and its sometimes crazy or destructive beliefs, but that with a variety of factors, including the Citizens United decision, opening floodgates for money in politics, social media, the Tea Party movement, the rise of billionaires who are supportive of the populist faction, think they can tame and control it. This has become the mainstream, the dominant strain of the Republican Party, not just a subordinate, if necessary or indispensable strain. The result, or one measure of this, or symptom of it at least, is that 70% of the Republican electorate thinks the election was stolen. That means 25% of the American people as a whole, and a substantial fraction, almost half of those people, believe that the use of force to restore Donald Trump to the presidency is justified, right? That means if you take the intersection, it's nearly 1 in 10 Americans who believe that the election was stolen and that the use of force is justified. And so in a sense, it's hardly surprising that the Capitol was being invaded, that the FBI is being shot up in its district office in Ohio. It's not, I think, in fact, at all surprising. What is perhaps surprising is if this is an accurate report of people's actual beliefs, that there isn't more political violence in our society right now. And so I say that advisedly as a warning, as an effort to sound the alarm bell. This stuff is potentially incredibly cataclysmic, right? It really has the power to destabilize democracy. So those 10% of Americans who believe the conjunction, the election was stolen and force is justified, the majority of them, almost 2/3, believe the Great Replacement theory, right? That African American and Hispanic people will have not the same, but more rights than whites, right? And so somehow the granting of rights is a competitive process, a zero-sum game in which the gains of one group are necessarily the loss of another group. Please note, this is, I think, really the heart of many of these conspiracy theories. And then we add to it, right, that the US government is ultimately controlled by a narrow band of people who are so corrupt and evil that you might as well call them Satan worshiping pedophiles, as the QAnon movement does. Again, this is about 1 in 20 Americans who purports to believe this, and based on their online viewing behavior, it looks like there's a real appetite for this stuff in a growing fraction of the American Republic. So we now come to the Republican Party, right? One of our two main political parties, which has increasingly become a vehicle for the seeding, spreading, and amplifying of these conspiracy theories, right? So we have election deniers running to run elections. There are a dozen of them Many of them have now succeeded in getting the nomination, and some of them are running in places where the Republican nominee is all but guaranteed to become the county or the state election official, the Secretary of State, etc. And so is now going to be in charge of supervising and registering the next elections, right? The 2024 presidential elections. And just to gesture again in this direction, the Arizona Republican Party has officially declared that it is not going to use the language of democracy anymore. That democracy seems to imply that everyone has a right to vote, and the Arizona Republican Party's position is instead that voting is a privilege and that it should not be too liberally uh, allowed to spread, to gain, to give too many people access to the ballot is a mistake. And so we need to reassert the idea that we are a republic, not a democracy, and thereby to confine access to the ballot and raise the bar, the level of scrutiny that people need to go under in order to be able to vote. Right. And so this is the way in which these lies, the previous election was stolen, the current election needs to be much more vigilantly supervised. That may include putting people in place to overturn the election results who believe that the last election was stolen, or an entire state party apparatus saying this is going to be our new identity as a party that is going to try to make it more difficult for these kinds of things to happen again. By the way, please note, right, that Florida under Ron DeSantis has set up a special office for prosecuting electoral fraud, and they're starting to go after people. Well, we'll have to see how that goes, but it is an indication that there is real energy, real mobilizing potential behind these campaigns. So this then leads me to the question, why are these big lies circulating in American politics in the 21st century? And I'm going to give an answer today to that question that emphasizes two big factors, although several others as well. And the first has to do with the transformation of the American media system, and in particular, the opening of the public sphere to a new knowledge system in which information circulates for profit on the basis of popularity, not verifiability. I will drill down on this, but I want to be as clear as possible, right? Part of the way this works is because it is now the case that these crazy ideas circulate readily, are amplified, and in a sense become the main media reality for a substantial portion of the American population. And let us be clear, right? Very, very, very few of us are in a position to verify the information that we rely on directly ourselves. We all rely on the media. And not only that, many of us, I think, lack the capacity to determine which of the various media outlets are credible, right? That there is a moment of faith or at least trust in media outlets that is indicative of the complexity and size and technical nature of a modern democracy, right? And so it's why we have a large and developed political media system, is because we need to figure out what's going on in a context in which many of us lack direct access to the relevant information. And so for people who are in a media environment that consistently feeds them and amplifies disinformation, it's hardly surprising that they come to have the credulity to believe the stuff that is, in a sense, obviously not true. Second, and relatively minor explanation, Richard Hofstadter has this wonderful book, The Paranoid Style in American Politics. It's about 50 years old now, but in that book, he argues that all the way back to the Anti-Federalists, etc., we have had a long period in which, I shouldn't say a long period, it's our entire history in which intermittently people have fallen for or been drawn into conspiracy style politics, right? And so this is perhaps part of the deep and long political culture of the United States. It's being reactivated in the 21st century in a new media environment and social conditions, which may make it even more dangerous. Third, and a very similar kind of explanation, we have a long history of nativism, of saying that the people who are here are special and different. And by the way, that means people of European descent, people who in the American political lexicon we call white, and a kind of populism that says all of us, all of the real citizens, the real people of the United States are in agreement. And so if you don't agree with our vision, you are not just the other party, the opposition, a different perspective, you are un-American, right? And that deep current of racial history is resurfacing in the 21st century, and in a sense, completely understandably and predictable that it would, right? That the idea that we are becoming a diverse democracy, that we will rapidly lose any racial majority, and that we're in the middle of a historical reckoning, not only with police violence, but with our long history of racist violence and racial privilege, in which citizenship was, for most of American history, a marker of white racial status and privilege. That as that is being eroded, it is natural that many people would be frightened, push back, try to find some way of denying that this is what justice and democracy require in the 21st century. The big lie, the QAnon conspiracy, the birther conspiracy about Barack Obama, this all give vent to these currents, deep currents of American thought. Fourth, the Tea Party, and then the Tea Party takeover of the Republican Party has mainstreamed, has given a credible, significant political institutional support to some of these crackpot ideas, right? And so it's one thing for your crazy uncle to have these views about UFOs, etc., right? In a sense, we live in a society in which some people have odd ideas, and we tolerate that, right? But when the obviously false become the orthodoxy of one of her major political institutions, we're in a very different world where this is no longer quirky or kooky, it is dangerous, right? And so this is the mainstreaming of paranoid populist suspicion in American politics. And of course, the hostile takeover of the Republican Party by Donald Trump is critical to understanding this. So with those ideas in mind, I now want to pull back to a higher level of analysis and ask, what is the work that conspiracy theories do for the people who subscribe to them, especially when they come to be widespread? And here I'm going to point to three basic ideas. One of them is that they simplify an overly complex, cognitively overburdening reality. And so I'm going to suggest in just a minute that part of what is giving rise to these theories' popularity is the erosion of economic security, the rise of economic precariousness for a substantial portion of the American working class, especially the white working class. And if I were to try to offer an explanation for the undermining of their economic security, the rise of their precariousness, I would point to globalization, automation, the use of computers, the outsourcing of labor, global wage competition, the decline of unions, the erosion of the minimum wage, the capturing of the Republican Party. These are all complex and structural explanations. They lack in satisfying simplicity, right? And what a conspiracy theory does is allow you to point and say it's their fault. We know who did this to us, to replace a complex, difficult to comprehend, and frankly, not very satisfying explanation with a very simple, straightforward explanation. This is the Chinese, right? This is the democratic deep state. This is the fault of immigrants, especially Mexicans. They're here to get your jobs, right? Simple story. Turns out it's not true. But frankly, a lot of times we prefer the satisfying to the true explanation. Second, and these three factors are related to each other. Second factor, and I'm going to use here the language, that the concept that Raymond Aron, a famous French sociologist, introduced. He introduced this idea of deep feeling structures, that many people have a sense for a while that sometimes it's hard for them to articulate, but that really animates their psychology, their sense of well-being. I'll give you a benign, fun example. First, your daughter seems to have a new sense of happiness and vitality. You don't know what it is. She hasn't shared it with you, but something good must have happened, right? And then later you learn that she's pregnant. She just wanted to wait a little while to tell you, and this is making her very happy. And then, right, you understand your deep feeling structure. Something really good was happening. Or you've been going to work for the last week and everybody seems to be gloomy and not particularly willing to engage with or talk with you. And then the next week you get your yellow slip, and you then recognize, right? Oh, I see, everybody but me knew I was about to be fired, right? And so there was that sense something's not right. And so Aron says, look, when we have deep feeling structures that are not just personal, but that are society wide, right? Or at least present in large portions of society, subcultures, if somebody finds a way to give expression to that feeling structure, if that feeling structure is not being expressed within the mainstream of public discourse, right? Which is perhaps limited by standards of verifiability or truth or credibility. And so they can't say exactly what's going on or articulate it in a way that gives satisfactory expression to it. And then somebody else comes along and articulates that incoherent sense that something is wrong and makes it clear and simple and powerful, and perhaps allows you to transmute your anxiety into anger. Guess what? That's a very powerful alchemy that person is performing for you. And many people are going to say, damn right, I knew something wasn't right. And he just hit the nail on the head. I'm with him, right? Third, and again, closely related, some of the work we've talked about together before, Daniel Kahneman's work, for instance, in dual process psychology, finds, and these are clever laboratory experiments to show that most people don't like complex statistical or structural explanations. They find them hard to follow, hard to remember, hard ultimately to maintain as a satisfactory explanation in their head. They have a strong preference for an explanation that assigns personal responsibility and causation. And ultimately, Kahneman and others who work on this suggest this comes out of our evolutionary history, right? When our mind, our brains developed the structures that we use for cognition in the 21st century, 200 or 300,000 years ago, being able to process statistical or long-term structural explanations didn't do us much good. But being able to recognize that that person is a threat to me, that was very valuable. So explanations that personalize, that assign precise, direct, intentional causation. China sent us that virus because they want to undermine us, right? That works. And so my suggestion to you is that now, particularly when we look at the media and the feeling structure of many Americans in the 21st century, we may begin to get a better explanation of why conspiracy theories are so powerful. And in particular, not just conspiracy theories or disinformation or propaganda, but the particular disinformation and propaganda that is circulating today and that seems to make it so hard to convince a substantial fraction of the American population that Donald Trump can do anything wrong, that it's the fact that it articulates, that it fits, that it has such a strong affinity with the feelings that so many Americans find troubling and that they were not finding adequate outlet for in mainstream politics, media, society. And so to make this as credible as possible, I'm going to return to something I've spoken with you about before, the work of the Berkeley sociologist, now retired, Arlie Russell Hochschild, and she's a practitioner of ethnographic sociology. She goes to communities and spends a long time there. In this case, she went to Southern Louisiana and met a whole bunch of people there and spent multiple years there. And the result is this book, Strangers in Their Own Land. And she starts her work there, just getting to know people. She spends years. Eventually, she sketches a story which she thinks would help to explain the politics and attitudes and ideas she's encountered. The story she sketches is of people waiting in line to get over a hill to a city. And that city is where opportunity, security, wealth are readily available to everyone who resides there, right? And so that's why they're waiting in line to get there. And in the past, that line had been moving steadily over that hill and into that city. But now, and maybe for the last 20 years, that line has stalled. It doesn't move forward anymore. Not only that, it seems to be moving backwards. And it's moving backwards because people are cutting in line in front of the patient, deserving, hardworking people who have been waiting in that line for a long time. And the people who are cutting in line tend to be Black or brown Latino or African American, maybe Asian. They're recent immigrants, and they're not just cutting in line. The government is assisting them and preventing the good people who keep getting pushed backwards from doing anything about the fact that people are getting in the way of their path to economic opportunity and security. And Hochschild tells the people of rural Louisiana her story, and they say, that's it. That's exactly what we think, what we feel. Thank you. You've given us the graphic allegory with which to understand our situation. And I'm going to just spend another minute on this because, in a sense, what I'm suggesting is Hochschild with her story is doing something very akin to what Trump is doing with his big lie, which is articulating the implicit feeling structure of a large group of people. And so the implicit social logic of Hochschild's story is very different from the left liberal implicit social theory, right? Where the left liberal implicit social theory says, no, this is about globalization. This is about wage competition. This is about automation. This is about the new power of artificial intelligence to do better what humans used to do, the decline of unions, etc. All structural explanations that don't allow you to say it's somebody's fault, right? And there's an alternative implicit social theory that the Tea Party and now the Make America Great wing of the Republican Party, which is increasingly 2/3, 3/4 of the party, offers, and that is that there are specific people to blame. They are immigrants. They are the undeserving racial minorities who elite white liberals have decided to help instead of helping the good, deserving, rural, or working class white people of the country. And the right competition between these two accounts, in a sense, I think explains a lot of the differences in political intuitions, reasons, arguments, priorities in American politics these days. And Donald Trump has taken something like Hochschild's story and made it the compelling narrative for one of our two main parties, right? And in 21st century America, the alternative left liberal social theory is increasingly a identity marker of the well-educated, right? This is the way we talk. This is the kind of explanation we like. And Trump, again, part of his genius is to ridicule that way of thinking and talking as being something that excludes and belittles ordinary Americans, right? And so it becomes the target for a great deal of resentment on the part of people who lack access to the education, the privilege, the opportunities that come with the credentials and the access to global networks of information and wealth that tend to be available to the people who prefer the structural explanation. Whereas QAnon, the big lie, the birther idea, these are rival social explanatory accounts that appeal to those who resent not only the structural accounts, but the people who offer them. They simplify, they make sense, and they give you someone to be angry about. So they are a much better fit for the implicit feeling structure. That's part of the reason why it's these particular narratives, right? So that's explanation number one. Let me go very quickly through this so I've got a moment for explanation number two, right? These are people whose deep feeling structure is one of alienation and mistrust for mainstream American social and political institutions, right? Those institutions have proved non-responsive and corrupt. We've talked about this before. If you're in the bottom 90%, there's very good evidence that your congressional representatives really don't listen to you, don't act on the basis of what you consider your priorities to be. These are also people who have been rendered precarious by recent structural transformations in the economy. That's not the explanation they like, but I think that's the accurate description of what's happening, and who discern, perhaps still in only a feeling structure way, that this is the ongoing trajectory of this economy. And so, although we have been rendered precarious over the last 20 or 50 years, the next 20 or 50 years may see us rendered completely dispensable. No place for us in this economy whatsoever. That is an incredibly anxious place to be, right? And by the way, it's not just us, it's our children and their children who we are going to get particularly animated and upset if we think they're not going to have any kind of future in this country. We add to this that our political culture, our elite political culture, increasingly challenges or even stigmatizes the identities of many of these people, that identities that had been understood until quite recently as carrying privilege and prestige with them, that now, right, as opposed to being the star of every TV series and movie made in America, we are increasingly being cast as Hillary Clinton's despicables, right? And then you add to that that the overall culture is changing very quickly in ways that many people find independently threatening. The religion of our forefathers is no longer the dominant religion of our society, and my own children may join in condemning people like me and want to explore alternative sexualities and genders. This can also produce a deep feeling of distrust, alienation, anxiety, and these myths, these conspiracy theories suggest there's someone to blame. This is not just the natural structural evolution of your society. Trump, while he was in office and still in his role as the leader of the Republican Party, allows people to maybe overcome aspects of that alienation. There's somebody finally who gets my situation, who's going to do something about it, who reasserts white male privilege in an incredibly empowered way, right? And so the threat of Trump being prosecuted is a threat to the person who promises to resolve some of these deep sources of anxiety. And then we add that the media system of the right wing amplifies and hermetically seals from challenge all of these stories. And so let me now turn concretely to that media system. And I'll have to be brief here for today, but I want to focus on two works in particular. One of them by Kaylin O'Connor and James Weatherall. They're both actually historians of science, and so they're looking at the spread of bad information about science, in particular the idea that tobacco was not a carcinogen, or that climate change is not real or not credibly established or even a hoax. And then three scholars who are doing much more directly political work. I've spoken with you about this work in the past: Yeshai Benkler, Robert Ferris, and Hal Roberts, mainly at Harvard University, though the research group they're part of is headquartered out of MIT, and their book from 2017 called Network Propaganda. I want to establish a little framework for analysis here, and to think about varying degrees of openness of a media system. And so we could talk about one extreme on a kind of continuum in which the media and information system of your country is under the control of the government and centrally managed by them as essentially just a propaganda wing of the government. We could think of Putin's Russia, where many people apparently still believe that this is not a full-scale invasion of the Ukraine and that it's justified because the Ukrainian government was taken over by Nazis, right? Clearly, this is not at all healthy for a democracy. It is anti-democratic. We could talk about a different kind of media system, which is one that is controlled by a few large corporations, oligopolistic, and in which what determines access to the ability to have your ideas transmitted within the public sphere, at least via media, is the commercial interests of those large corporations, right? And so if tobacco companies are giving the news media a lot of money in advertisement, it may be that creates an incentive for the news media not to cover especially critically some of the emerging scientific ideas about the relationship between smoking tobacco and cancer. Third, moving now closer to the middle, would be a media where it's primarily experts who are presenting, generating the content of the media, but they're experts who are more open to scientific or popular inputs, right? So they don't just do the bidding of their corporate overlords, but they go where their investigation, information, thinking, learning takes them. Moving now closer to a wide open public sphere and media system. This is a media system in which there are genuine opportunities for bottom-up spontaneous attention formation. So a media system in which it's not just experts or media professionals, but ordinary people have access to media outlets and are able to, if what they say is credible or connects, gain traction and attention. And you might say that the public sphere of the early American Republic, right, the period in which the revolution occurred, was somewhere between the third and the fourth year. And then the final example, the final degree of openness, is a flooded, distracted, cognitively overloaded, unreliable media sphere in which everything circulates. It's impossible to discern what is credible and what isn't credible, so-called drinking from the fire hose. And you will probably recognize that I think we are now somewhere in between 4 and 5, that the digital transformation and disruption of the American media system has pushed us in the direction of 5, of this drinking from the fire hose kind of media system. One way to put this is we've moved very quickly from a corporate controlled to a completely flooded media system, skipping the more valuable intermediaries in between them. I can put this in a slightly different way, which is that if we look at the degree of openness of a media system to inputs and try to correlate that with the degree to which the public opinion formation that results is both deliberative and responsive to wide-held public ideas. As the media system gets more and more open, public opinion formation gets more deliberative and responsive up to a point. But I think this is important to see. There's such a thing as too much openness. And at that point, the degree of deliberation and responsiveness actually declines. And that we have moved maybe from over here to over here very quickly in roughly the last 20 years with the coming online of new social media and digital technology. Very quickly, to go back to some of this science work, part of what these authors, right? And I'll just point out to you very quickly, right? That is a jackalope, right? That's a cross between a rabbit and an antelope. Some of you may have, if you've gone camping, seen lodges with these creatures mounted on the wall, right? And Kaylin O'Connor and James Weatherall are interested in the fact that for actually a long time in European history, fanciful creatures were considered to be scientifically verified, right? And so Connor and Weatherall present these diagrams, and I'll be very quick, of different structures of networks of connectivity between people trying to decide what to believe, right? And so this is a network in which people connect only to maybe two other people. And if they're going to connect to somebody further away, it's got to get to them through the wheel of the cycle. This is a different network in which people are connected by a single central authority and then also connected to others who are proximate to them in their network. This is a model of complete interconnectivity between people. And the reason I spend a moment on this is that what they're suggesting is that we can actually look at the structure of opinion formation networks and determine by looking at the structure how reliable, open, deliberative, verifiable information transmission and opinion formation will be based on the structure of the network of communication in which it occurs. This is a model of scientific opinion change. And so two things to see. There are two people in black nodes in a network of scientific research who have discovered a new result. They are reasonably confident of the result. They keep doing experiments. They become more confident. They change another person's mind. They do more experiments. They become more confident. They change another couple people's minds. And eventually, a new consensus emerges. And eventually, if it keeps being replicated, everybody comes to have a high degree of confidence in this idea that was originally a dissident idea in which just a couple people had a low degree of confidence. So that's an example of a network that allows, and attitudes on the part of the people in the network that allow for good public opinion formation. These are examples of polarized or fragmented networked opinion formation. Here we have two groups of people, some of whom have the right idea and have a high degree of confidence in it, others of whom have the wrong idea and varying degrees of confidence. But given that the people with the wrong idea mainly communicate with each other and reinforce each other in having the wrong idea, that there are only a couple of connections between the network that transmits the true or verified idea and the other network, it is the case that the network that maintains false beliefs is recalcitrant, can't be penetrated, unlike the network in the previous example, where people were open to and ultimately convinced. Now, the reason to look at these kinds of highly schematic ways of thinking about networks of communication is because it allows us to understand, in part, how it is that policymakers are sometimes more readily convinced by propagandists than they are by scientists. And the two examples that are central here, one of them to do with tobacco, the other to do with climate change, in which propagandists are paid, right? We think of lobbyists to present only the information that agrees with their side and to peddle disinformation or to be merchants of doubt about anything that doesn't agree with their side. And if they have fairly direct avenues of connection with policymakers, if policymakers also find some scientists who also seem to align with the propagandists, despite the fact that the majority of scientists don't, it may be enough to persuade the policymakers not to regulate tobacco or not to take climate change as the existential threat that it is. Now, the reason, and let me conclude this quickly, that I point to this is that the work of Bankler, Ferris, and Roberts, and we talked a little bit about this before, suggests that around 2016, the American media system started to look like one of those networks that is polarized and susceptible to disinformation, propaganda, or conspiracy theory that cannot be corrected. And to zoom in on this a little bit, what they show is basically there is a dense network of interconnectivity on the far right of the media ecosystem and an alternative dense network in the middle and the left. But in particular, very little communication between the far right and the rest of the media ecosystem, especially the far right media ecosystem looking at what's happening in the left, and that this requires or emerges from a media system that has been disrupted and transformed by social media. This was not the case and probably not possible as long as there were just a few main leading media systems and outlets, and those outlets subscribed to a journalistic ethics and a model of verification that said we only will transmit this information if we're convinced that it's credible. And by the way, if we find another of our outlets, our rival, engaged in duped by disinformation, we are going to immediately call attention to it, and there will be consequences. There will be loss of credibility for those formerly leading media outlets, right? And that model has been fundamentally upended, and the result is that the capacity to reveal disinformation on the part of these new and very powerful conspiracy theories, propaganda myths, has been dramatically reduced and eroded for the portion of the population that stays exclusively in the right-wing media ecosystem.
Okay,
All right, so give me a second, I'm getting this feedback. I am muting everybody, but I also am going to stop here. I just want to note one thing, and I will fast forward to, I did have more stuff that I was going to show to you, but let me really come to the final question, the big takeaway. What can we do, right? What are the implications of this analysis? And here I want to really focus on questions more than answers. So if part of what is allowing this disinformation to take hold in a substantial portion of the American population, and to do so in ways that are terribly threatening to our democracy, is an underlying, what I'm calling feeling structure, incoherent sense that things are really not right, and that most of the mainstream is not able or willing to do something about it. What can be done to actually address the social conditions or situation that make that feeling structure credible, accurate, or widespread? And I'm, like I say, I'm happy to discuss with you possible answers to that question. But I think in the first instance, just having the question as clear as possible, as opposed to saying, those damn idiots, how can they believe that stuff? What in the world is wrong with them? a little bit more of a sympathetic perspective, which says this theory is doing some work for them. And what can we do so that they don't need a theory like this to do that work? Second big question: what can be done to regulate or influence the media system so that the public sphere is less prone to circulating and amplifying disinformation, right? We have regulatory frameworks that were generated in the 1950s and 1960s still in place in the 2020s. How can we update our approach to media literacy and regulation so that we can at least damp down some of this viral disinformation spread? And then I'll just point out that although these are the right questions, part of what's going to make them so hard to answer and then act on the answers is the fact that in this world in which we live, in which so much disinformation is spreading, and we have a charismatic, populist, aspiring authoritarian leader spreading the disinformation, it's going to be really hard to break through and to act in these ways. All right, so sorry, I know I went over time a little bit. Who wants to start us out on the discussion today? John, go ahead.
What should be done? We should shut up and stop taking every opportunity to antagonize all these people and to pursue what is really important, which is trying to protect our electoral system in all the various states and all of those sorts of things. Let Trump keep his stupid documents. The percentage of secret documents that actually amount to anything, not let him keep them, they've got him away. But once they got him out of the mansion, why not just drop it right there? What's the point? To prevent future presidents from stealing documents? Everybody steals documents. The number of cases they've had have been enormous. None of it has ever made any difference. But I don't think there's anything you can do about the media system. I don't think there's anything you can do, to answer your other three questions other than just let's be a little more low key and sensible.
So if we're low key, do you think this boils over?
If we're low, how does low key boil over?
So if it's, I'm sorry, blows over, I guess is what I should say. Do you think that eventually the fever breaks?
Maybe. I think the chances are better there than anything else you could think of.
All right. So essentially, let our fellow citizens come to their senses rather than trying to prosecute a president who tried to orchestrate a coup. Presumably, yes. The implication of your view would also be that probably we shouldn't be prosecuting too many of the people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th unless they harmed people physically rather than doing damage to property. Do I have the basic gist of what you're saying, right, John?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And look, that is another and I think credible approach, which is to say sometimes when you're dealing with your raging, crazy teenage son, you just put a punching bag up in the garage and hope that it blows over, right? That eventually they'll mature and come to their senses. I have to admit, I worry that the alternative outcome to that approach is that this movement in American politics just keeps gaining strength, and that we have Trump as president again. We have perhaps DeSantis or somebody else, if not Trump, and that it's more vicious, it's more destructive, it's more authoritarian, it's more racist the next time round, because that certainly seems the path it's headed down right now.
Well, that certainly is a possibility, but I haven't heard you or anybody else suggest anything that lessens that possibility. So, throwing them all in jail isn't going to work. So anyway, someone else probably has a better view than I do.
Thank you, John, and I appreciate the provocative suggestion that maybe the best thing to do is to let them burn themselves out. Who else wants to throw out an idea here today? And go ahead. You're still muted, Ann. You have to unmute yourself.
There we go.
There you go.
The concept of doing nothing, in one sense, to me, raises the issue that the other side will then get just as angry that nothing was done. I don't know if that won't polarize us more.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it has to be a strategy, and in a sense, it seems like the Democrats, we elected the president who is closest to saying, okay, let's just pretend that was a bad dream, or let's go back to normal, right? And perhaps the appetite was for that, and that maybe that president is, by going back to normal, by not tweeting and not paying very much attention to this hyper accelerated media news cycle, getting us back to a place where actually some meaningful legislating occurs, right? And so, as opposed to being so focused on that awful man, concentrate more on doing something about climate change, doing something about prescription drug costs, doing something about decaying infrastructure, et cetera. That might be, right, in a sense, where people thought, based on the outcome of the Democratic primaries a few years ago, where we needed to go. So I think you probably hear, I'm much more inclined to think, well, no, we actually have to enforce our laws, right? And so I think it is worth noting that people have actually lost their jobs and often pleaded to misdemeanors, not felonies, right? Because they've taken home documents that they weren't supposed to take home, right? And nothing terribly sinister in that. And that if we think about it a little bit more, Donald Trump took these documents home, was asked to give them back, refused to give them back, lied about having them, right? And may have been holding on to them for some nefarious reasons, right? In part to use them as a get out of jail free card, so that if anybody came after him in another count, he could say, oh, no, you don't, I'll reveal state secrets, right? That we would be rewarding quite bad behavior. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, my thought is that we probably ought to go ahead, and it'll outrage the diehard Trump loyalists. But once in a while, there's a Republican who says, "Man, this ain't right." And I'm thinking of Liz Cheney and a couple of others. And our elections tend to be fairly close. So if you can split off a few people who think that this isn't really a great, principle on which to organize the Republican Party, that might enhance the possibility that Trump does not get reelected. That's my thought.
Yeah, so we've got Liz Cheney, we've got Mitt Romney. Of late, we even maybe have Mike Pence every now and then, Adam Kissinger, right? We do have some Republicans, and to varying degrees, right? I think it depends in part on how much they care about electoral math and getting reelected, right? Cheney just basically committed electoral suicide as a matter of principle, and who knows, it may ultimately serve her long-term ambition, although I'm not sure about that. But she might also have said, here I stand, I can do no other. This is a central principle. So I think Matt is absolutely right, which is to say, one consequence of this would be, in the short term, Trump or his associates or all of the above get convicted, go to jail. And not only that, call it 2% of former Trump supporters say, I guess I was wrong to support that guy. And I have to rethink my political allegiances, because if the whole party is falling in behind him, then there's something wrong with the party, not just with that particular leader. And that's enough to swing an election, right? Because our swing states are so closely divided. And even if that's right, Matt, I just have to point out, it still leaves us in a situation with, let us call it, a third of the American population mad as hell, alienated, mistrustful, thinking that the one guy who stood up for them just got taken down because he stood up for them, right? And so it might be politically advantageous for the Democrats, let's grant that, but still socially destructive. So I thought I saw, and the name, yeah, go ahead.
It's David Pearson.
Right.
I'm Barbara Schonborn's husband.
Yes, I got it, David. I didn't think you were Barbara. Go ahead.
Well, an alternative possibility is that the existence of meta-narratives of the ilk that the Republican Party has now, that the deep feeling explanations of that allow you to explain everything that's happening, are necessary for human beings to make sense of their lives. And the problem with progressives is that we think that facts are the alternative to a meta-narrative, where what we really need is a different meta-narrative. And we have had those a few times in the progressive political tradition. I would argue that Roosevelt had a meta-narrative, probably Kennedy had one for a while, certainly Johnson had one about the Great Society. And what we have not been able, what folks who oppose the sort of the self-centered version of the meta-narrative don't have, is one that is broadly appealing. And someone like George Lakoff would argue that that's our problem, that the Tea Party folks have been just much more effective and clever about finding guiding metaphors that allow people to explain what's going on in their lives. And that's what we need to do. It isn't that we don't need facts and the like. What we need is some kind of organizational structure in which to assemble those facts so they make sense in explaining our lives as well as the lives of other people who feel currently disenfranchised.
Yeah, and so George Lakoff at Berkeley, who you're referring to, right, as a linguist, influentially argued for a long time that the Democrats have a rhetoric problem, but that this rhetoric problem is in part rooted in their policy and social positions, right? And so that there's just a kind of structural advantage to the way in which Republican policy priorities, which point to personal responsibility and individualism, fit with people's ordinary moral psychology and the way in which that is articulated linguistically. But that every now and then the Democrats have been able to construct an alternative narrative that has been satisfying and done parallel work. And so I would think, for instance, of FDR and the very strongly anti-oligarchic rhetoric that FDR used, right? Blaming the robber barons, blaming the rich, blaming the banks, blaming the Republican Party for being in the pocket of those interests, right? And that somehow the Democratic Party seems mainly to have lost its populist instincts over the last 50 years, right? There was a brief moment, maybe under Obama, where when Mitt Romney was his rival, Obama found it to his advantage to point out what Romney had done for a living and how much money he had made by taking over companies and laying people off. But it only was a kind of brief, momentary strategic pivot into that kind of populism. And that the Democrats need to do better. I think that the problem is, and I think it's twofold. The first is that it just doesn't stand in continuity with any currently existing political narratives. It's going to feel like a really rough transition if the Democrats all of a sudden start painting themselves as economic populists again. And then the second thing I would say is that we're in a highly divisive political period. And I think part of what John is trying to say is, turn the temperature down a little bit. Maybe that's the best way to prevent us from having more political violence, more polarization and fragmentation in our society. The alternative strategy, the Lakoff strategy, is to say, no, let's identify our enemy and go after them, fight fire with fire. And of course, that may ultimately be the best strategy, but it does run the deep risk of heightening polarization and animosity. All right, everybody, we're coming up on an hour and a half here. It's been great being with you. I hope you found this to be interesting. I think that these ideas are ones that are really important to get clear about, right? How can so many people in our society believe stuff that is so obviously false, and what can we do about it? I don't think I gave you a clear answer, especially to the second part of that question, but I think it's extremely important. Well, thank you, Flossie. I appreciate the vote of confidence. But having said that, I hope you have some stuff to chew over. I'll see you guys next week. Take care. Be well. Thanks, everybody.
Next week for the solutions.
Thanks, David.
Yeah. Please spend the next 7 days coming up with all the answers. I'll give you that homework assignment. Okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you. Take care.